Hello, and welcome to I Am Dad Podcast with your fatherhood authority, Kenneth Braswell. 30 minutes of wisdom, information, resources, and nugget on your fatherhood journey. Or maybe you're just curious and want to hear some real talk about fatherhood, family, and the minds of men. Well, guess what? We got you too. Sit back, grab your pad and pen, and maybe even bring a little something to sip on. Enjoy 30 straight minutes of fatherhood, family, and fun with the Fatherhood Authority, Kenneth Braswell.
Welcome to I Am Dad Podcast. I'm your host, Kenneth Braswell. Thank you once again for joining us on a Sunday morning. We appreciate each and every last one of you. Today, I have the honor of introducing Anna Tarrant, a professor of sociology and an esteemed voice in the field of fatherhood research, as the director of the following Young Fathers Further Study and head of the new Center for Innovation in Fatherhood and Family Research at the University of Lincoln. Anna is at the forefront of shaping the discourse around young fatherhood. With a keen voice and focus on the parenting journeys and support needs of young fathers, particularly in low-income families, her work is pivotal in driving policy and practice to better support these men and their families. Today, we'll explore transformational and societal perspectives of young fathers, discuss Anna's influential research, and uncover insights into nurturing the potential of these young families. Prepare with us to dive into and uncover insights about these families. Let's welcome Anna to the I Am Dad Podcast. How are you today?
I'm great. Thanks, Kenneth. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you accepting the call, to come on the podcast. I'm always trying to be innovative in these conversations. And so I don't know if you've listened to any of our podcasts. I'm sure you have. But at the beginning of our podcast, we start with a question because it sets the stage for the following conversation. And that question is, tell us your daddy story.
My daddy story, that's a lovely question. I've always been really privileged with my dad and my granddads and male role models in my family. And interestingly, that's kind of what drove my research interests. So when I was doing my undergraduate degree at Lancaster University in the UK, I was really interested in kind of the absence of narratives and stories about men being positive in families and in terms of their relationships with their daughters. So I kind of followed that thread over time, essentially. First of all, doing my PhD research around grandfathers and their role in family life. I interviewed some of his kind of friends and colleagues, and was just really struck by how much they appreciated actually being asked a question: what's it like to be a granddad? What's your family life like? And then over time, I've kind of become more interested in men in low-income families, and still with a reference towards how can we ensure that men can have the role in families that I've experienced as well in my own upbringing. My dad is hugely supportive of my career, of my emotional well-being. I've been highly successful in my career. And I think it's that longer term support that I'd like to see all dads be able to deliver and provide for their children, daughters or sons.
Mm-hmm. As you began and as you continue to do this work, I know it happened for me and it happened for most of the folks that I know doing this work. It brings a different level of clarity between us and our fathers, regardless of the relationship or connection. Doing this work, has it given you any clarity about your father, something that you're like, or something that warmed your heart? What kinds of things have you come across that has brought a little bit more clarity to you with respect to your father?
Well, that's a really good question. I think just for me, becoming a parent myself, weirdly. So, I have 2 young children, and obviously I say obviously, but I am married, and sort of observing my own husband parenting, and you appreciate your parents more when you become a parent, I think, because you realise just how hard it is. It's completely wonderful and the most amazing thing I've ever done. I have a son and a daughter, and they both need completely different kind of sets of support and involvement. I think just his ability, and my mum as well, to just adapt to us, to learn us and go on a journey with us as we're developing and as we're working out who we are, has been really powerful. So I kind of have more clarity in the sense that I understand some of the frustrations. I understand, where things were challenging, but also that fundamentally that relationship's about love and it's about nurturance. And, if it's done well, being a good dad is about, supporting your child to get ahead and to do the things they really want to do and will flourish through.
Mm-hmm. As you've begun to do this work, has there been any obstacles that you've run into that you didn't expect to run into? Because I know that doing this work, I often tell people, when you're working for men and you're working for fathers, it could be a little difficult because people have their own, idiosyncrasies and biases about dads and stereotypes about dads. What kind of things have you run into that is somewhat frustrating to you?
Again, a really good question. I think my research interests have always been around how we think about low-income and marginalised men in society. And I'm very critical of the way in which different social disadvantages kind of translate into these deficit perspectives around dads. So I argue in my recent book, it was published in 2021, called Father in Poverty, that we talk about these men as absent and deadbeat, feckless, irresponsible, and they're hyper-visible, I argue, in kind of policy and practice discourses in those negative ways. So that's a frustration for me because I don't think it's based on sound evidence. And my research has been about developing an evidence base by actually engaging and speaking to those men to understand what challenges they faced, why that might make them have challenges in their relationships with their children or their partners or co-parents, and just try to shift away from a blame approach, how we think about those fathers, and more about an explanation of the sort of systems and processes around them and society, cultural discourses, all of those things, and how that might contribute to challenges they might have in their relationships and or their ability to be there for their children.
Mm-hmm. We are, as a part of my organization, we launched 2 years ago the Moynihan Institute for Fatherhood Research and Policy, not named after Senator Moynihan, but more focused on a report that he wrote that was a report to speak about particularly black families and more specifically black fathers. And one of the things that we have, and so the Institute was pulled together to really do a few different things to expand the report into more research, to articulate the report and correct the report, because there's a lot of things in there that needed to be corrected in the way that they were mentioned. But again, we often have to remind people that it was not a research report brief. It was a report, and that was all it was. It is up to us to then build on that conversation. But one of the things, Anna, when you're talking about socioeconomic spaces for these fathers, particularly low-income fathers, we have begun to start saying when it comes to when people use the word deadbeat, we'll always say, they're not deadbeat, they're dead broke. Those are two different things, right? And so of the fathers that we serve in our programs, we have not, I've been in this game 20 years, I have not come across a father yet who did not want to be in the life of his child. It's Absolutely. A matter of how he is in the life of his child. What distinctive characteristics have you seen with respect to the fathers that you're serving that's serving as obstacles for these fathers when income is an issue?
Well, I just want to come back to a point you were saying there as well. I mean, there's a really good academic book that tries to critique this idea of blame of fathers, and these kind of deficit narratives. And it tries to turn on its head failing fathers, that idea, into societies are failing our fathers. And I really like that because I think that pushes us to think in a different way. And the ways in which we're failing our fathers, in the UK, the US, we see it globally, really, albeit in slightly different ways, and it manifests in slightly different ways. There is poverty and inequality. It's the removal of resource from localities that leads to men sort of finding there's a limit to family, but then also finding relationships within like gangs, for example, or in perhaps more violent contexts. I think the fact that we've had this kind of huge shift over time, we've seen this deindustrialisation occur both again in the UK and the US, where access to stable employment and obviously then male identities have kind of come under threat as such, or they've shifted and changed. And for some people, that's had a positive impact and outcome, and people are able to invest in their father identities in particular ways. But then for other men, I think they take on, or they sort of internalise this idea that they're a failed father because they're failing economically. And actually, because we undervalue care in society, we're missing a trick there. You know, I think we're missing the fact that being a father, investing in that identity, developing caring, nurturing relationships is really powerful, and it's a really important aspect of well-being and family well-being as well. It also opens up opportunities for gender equality and for men and women to sort of share interests, because we do share interests. I think very often as a society, gender separates us from one another. We're actually in relationships with one another, and that's whether you're heterosexual, same-sex couple, whatever that might be. We're in broader sets of relationships. I think over time we're also sort of seeing, particularly for young fathers, an increase in challenge around financial security. Again, that's linked to lack of employment opportunities. We've got 0-hour contracts in the UK. That doesn't mean that men can take parental leave, for example. So our welfare, our market systems, family policy systems don't align with one another, and they serve them to sort of increase those inequalities that men experience trying to be a caregiver.
Mm-hmm. You know, one of the accountability or responsibility pieces that I've been talking to researchers about is our responsibility, right? To make sure that when we are doing research and when we are articulating research and putting research out there for the general public, that we try to put it in plain English by writing books. You can write your journals and your papers for your peer reviews and do all of that stuff, but it has to be translated for people to really understand what you're trying to say. One of the things that, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about this later, but I just want to put a pin in it now. We've been talking a lot these days about the differences between resident and non-resident dads.
Yeah.
And what that looks like, right? And then you add on poverty on top of resident and non-resident, and it adds a whole nother layer of what we're dealing with respect to dads. And so what we've been also talking to agencies like child support about as they're trying to figure out how to serve fathers, right? And so we're trying to figure out how do you translate that language to the historical perspective that fathers have about child support and what child support has been, to them. But really getting them to look at embracing the notion that worth should not solely be predicated on their ability to earn money. Right, that there are other things that are just as equally, if not more important than the check itself. And the number one thing for me is presence, right? And so if he's not there, he can't add anything to the equation. When you're working with these fathers, particularly the ones that are really dealing with the inability to earn money, what have you heard from them in the voices of their frustration?
It's a really interesting tension, I think, especially for young dads. They're not just non-resident young dads. I just want to make that distinction as well. I think it's really interesting to often get asked if we're doing research on single dads. We're saying no, we're actually doing a broad sweep of research on young fathers, and some of them are single or non-resident. But some of them are still in relationships, and that shifts over time as well. But they grapple with societal expectation that they're a provider, an academic provider. And again, they internalise this idea that they might be a failed father if they're not able to provide that care, that kind of care. And I think men do conceptualise provision as care, and that's something we're really seeing in our data. In terms of other things around economic provision, I think the idea of father identity is redemptive for lots of these men. So we do actually really invest in that identity and are present, I think, when they're not in work. And actually, ironically, they're probably more present in some ways with their children than those who are working all the time. And again, I'm quite critical of absence of presence because they're binaries. So what I mean by that is they sort of are two sides of a different coin. And actually, things are much more complicated than that. What we see with the young dads is that they overcome the frustrations of not being able to work by investing that time in their children. And, whether they're resident or not, they make a huge effort to look after their children, to be with their children, and do what we might call private fathering. So what I mean by that is that resourced families or resourced fathers, I think, do much more public fathering. And again, it's the language that's been used in academic literature. So they take their children to after-school clubs. You see them on the football field doing the coaching or getting cross with the coach because the child's not winning, that kind of stuff. But what I think low-income fathers and young fathers are doing is that much more kind of home-based care. And again, that gets undervalued. And I think they find that frustrating because, again, they're assumed to be absent. They're assumed that they're invisible in policy and practice and to the public. But actually, they're doing a huge amount of care on behalf of their children. So there's a whole range of different frustrations, very much linked to also who they think they are in terms of their identity as well. They question, am I a man? I'm not working and balancing all of these different things. What kind of man does it make me if I'm not invested in my children's lives, my partner's lives, and then also being a citizen as a worker? And they find that really hard. It affects their mental health.
Mm-hmm. So when you were writing the book, or when you started and finished the book, or as you were writing Fathering and Poverty, what were you trying to say? What were you trying to get people to understand?
But we need to be critical of this idea that men are absent. I think that they are, as I say, hyper visible. So we assume that they're absent. We readily, argue, or especially policymakers say, well, what we're going to do about these absent dads, this crisis of fatherlessness that apparently pervades all of our low-income communities. And I was saying, well, we don't actually, where are those men? What is their participation in families? What does that look like? So when I started that project, that research, I went out and said, who are low-income men? And let's look at them as fathers, or let's look at them as male caregivers and not failed workers. And I found men across the whole spectrum of different generations. So I talked to young dads who are 25 and under in policy practice terms. I talked to single and sometimes non-resident fathers. Some of them were actually primary caregivers, which again is unusual. It's a relatively small number of men in those roles. But then also male kinship carers as well. So granddads or uncles who were taking on the care of nieces, nephews, grandchildren, in contexts where there were child protection concerns and the parent generation was no longer there. And they do a huge amount of work and provide a huge amount of care to sustain their relationships with their grandchildren, with their children, and to keep their families together. For me, that's quite a simple argument, that it's a way of saying the evidence just doesn't support a crisis of fatherlessness. It doesn't support the absent deadbeat dad. It just doesn't.
Now, you're in the UK, and that was some of what intrigued me with respect to your work, because I do think that across the world we need to be mindful of what this looks like in families everywhere, right? There are a ton of similarities. There are more similarities than things are not the same when you look at families, no matter where you look at them. Yeah. I'm sure that in the UK that you pay attention somewhat to what is happening in the US with respect to this work and the conversation and the dialogue and all of the things that are moving. What have you seen with respect to some of the differences between what you might be seeing in the UK and what you're seeing in the US?
That's a really good question, because I think in the UK we tend to follow America in lots of ways, not always in a positive way. There was a really interesting analysis of data in 2004 comparing how we think about young parents in the US and in the UK. And the argument was that in the US, our kind of societal concern around young parenthood, and that includes mothers and fathers, was associated with race and with welfare dependency. And then over in the UK, the argument was that we're concerned around teenage pregnancy because of public health concerns. So, the idea that the earlier you have a child, the more likely there might be challenges to that child. Long-term outcomes might not be as positive compared to a wider group of the population. But I think over time that's really shifted. There was a big concern around welfare dependency in the US in the sort of 2000s. And since 2010, when we've had really stringent austerity politics and measures in the UK, there's been a much closer alignment of young parenthood and welfare dependency. And this argument that if you have a child young, you're more likely to be dependent on the state and on social security. I think that's kind of one of the similarities that's played out in both contexts, but it's been slower, I think, in the UK over time. The problem with that is that you demonise and you blame and stigmatise families, but then how do you support? And I think we're perhaps lagging in the UK compared to the US. So it's been really interesting to read a lot of the research in the US around parenting programmes, around the Responsible Fatherhood programme. I don't think we're anywhere near there or close to that in terms of family policy, certainly in the UK. At the moment, we're still trying to argue that there should be 6 weeks of paternity pay or leave for fathers. Although again, I'm confident in the US, it's not even great for mums, So yeah.
We're still fighting those battles, as well. It seems like just listening to you that we're dealing with the same things, and that is why we need to pay more attention to what's working everywhere or what's not working everywhere.
Yeah.
Right. And so one of the things that, particularly for the dads that we also have a grant with the federal government to provide direct services here in Atlanta, Georgia. And so we're in the 4th year of that grant, and we are really doing a phenomenal job with getting fathers in and extending some of this work to their families to begin to incorporate the conversation of co-parenting, right? Because it is one thing to kind of help a father build his capacity to be a better father that he wants to be and desires to be in his family, but then there's this relationship thing, right? And we have to kind of do some work in making sure that they are communicating and that they're supporting each other and that they're still living, surviving, and self-sustaining of themselves individually and collectively. So when you are in the work that you're doing in the UK, how often are you running up against systems? Because one of the things that I always say about, and I think this is true for all parents, but it's probably more true for low-income parents. They seem to be okay until a system gets involved. And once a system gets involved, it causes issues that they're not prepared for. And the more systems that get involved in their lives, the more entangled they are and frustrated at each other. And I don't think oftentimes they understand what's happening to them when they get within the welfare system or when they get within the child support system or the criminal justice system or the child welfare system or the health system or the education system. That every time they get involved in another system, just because of the policies within those systems, it causes stress and tension between them. Are you seeing some of that as well?
Oh, 100%. And actually a lot of our more recent work, so you mentioned I'm director of Following Your Fathers Further, has actually been all about trying to address the ways in which fathers are excluded, and particularly young fathers are excluded by systems and services. We see a huge amount of fear, a lack of confidence around how to engage with professionals or to work with professionals. The young dads interested want to be seen as kind of clients or beneficiaries of services, especially when they need sort of wider support around employment, around finances, around whatever it is that helps them to father effectively, whether it's housing, education, employment, those kinds of things. But then they encounter systems that are mother-centric, and that's partly for good reason, in the sense that, from a public health perspective, the relationship between mum and child is important. But that often translates then into these kind of gendered disadvantages, and fathers either get sidelined by professionals, so they're not thought about at all. Professionals will only deal with mum and baby and not with dad. Or they get overly surveillanced. And we use this language of sidelining and surveillance to try and make sense of what happens when professionals and when services do interact with fathers or not. When they become over surveillance, that's based on a risk-based view of fathers. So we're not seeing them as a resource to the wider family unit, we're seeing them as a potential risk. There are obviously going to be some cases where that is the case, where there's a domestic abuse or there's perpetuation of violence. But the kind of blanket assumption that all men are at risk is really problematic, and that gets reinforced again through high workloads. So professionals not having enough time always to engage with the whole family. The ways in which we might collect data about fathers. So do we collect data about fathers? Do we ask if men are dads? I don't think that we always do. We don't associate them with fatherhood and parenthood in those ways. It can be about sort of gendered occupational cultures as well. So many professionals are women and don't necessarily feel confident themselves around how to engage with men and with fathers. And organisational structures themselves, policies, visions, don't necessarily think about dad or include dad. So they're putting up against all of these different challenges. It's stressful and problematic for dads. It's difficult for professionals, because actually, when we speak to professionals, they do want to support dads and they recognise that the whole family strengths-based approach is important. But systems sort of push towards this more risk-based, deficit model.
Mm-hmm. In the UK, are you seeing any intentional investments from the government in terms of supporting social service agencies to pay more attention to dads and to resource them to be able to do that? Because it's one thing to say, I need you all to focus on not just moms, but dads too, and then resource the ability to do that, and then train these organizations to somewhat adjust their traditional ways of providing social services to then understand this almost new client, right, which is men.
I think that just the straightforward answer is no, not really. We have a very kind of, I'd say, a fragmented funding system, which I suspect has parallels with the US as well. So one thing I'm trying to advocate for at a policy level through the research is for an investment in father inclusion as a vision and as a kind of manifesto that drives and helps us to think about how funding gets allocated to different services. What we're actually seeing in the UK is through my research and through funding from voluntary sector organisations or philanthropic organisations, the sort of increase in specialist services that engage with fathers. They're a bit of a postcode lottery. So what I mean by that is that certain groups are able to attract pockets of money, but they're doing it on an ad hoc basis. The funders might not always fund that work or see the value of that work. And you need the people on the ground who are able to build relationships of trust with dads, which takes time and perseverance when you're trying to engage with men who might be underconfident or fearful of their interactions with services because of past histories. They're not sustainable as such. While they're doing really incredible work, and they're providing peer support, they're providing one-to-one support around what dads need to be the dad they want to be, they're short-lived, or they're at risk of being short-lived. So what I'm really pushing for with my work and with my research is there is evidence that dads want to be included. They tell us they want to be included and seen as a resource for family. Professionals tell us they want to support dads, but there's no training and it's hard to sustain services. So we need a bigger structure or bigger framework that's driven by policy that more than nudging people to try and do those things.
Well, it's keeping me on the road a lot because most of the times I'm on the road, I'm training. And whether it is a state government entity or a county level entity or another not-for-profit that is doing work of fatherhood, I have always said that although it tires me out, it's a good thing because people want to do the work and they want to do it right.
Yeah.
Right. And so I am, and somewhat, blessed to see that we have been able to get other disciplines within social services to begin to start seeing how fatherhood plays into what it is they're providing. I always say, listen, we have a mantra that says, what about dad? Like anybody who sees Kenneth Braswell walks in the room know that I have one thing in mind. I don't care what you're talking about. And it is, what about dad? We're talking about it, whether it's housing, substance abuse, DV, everything. We should be in every room. And I think part of that is beginning to stimulate others to begin to seriously think about how do you do that, and which leads me to wanting to really understand the Center for Innovation in Fatherhood and Family Research within a university, because I'd never thought about that before. And so in the sense that you guys are doing it, so I want you to talk about that, but I want to say this first. One of the things that we have been thinking about and some have been tinkering around with is going into schools of social work within universities to begin to start encouraging them to include a heavier emphasis on fatherhood within social services. And so we are still at today, 2024, social workers are coming out of college and have had no conversation whatsoever in their understanding and their studies around fatherhood. So I'm curious as to how the Center for Innovation is working and who came up with that idea, and then how did you make it happen?
So, basically, it's a bit of a strange history, but it's actually only been in existence for a year or so. So it's right on the cusp of kind of developing its offer, really. But the Future Leaders Fellowship that I lead, this is a £1.7 million government-funded project, I should say. So I applied for that because I was really interested in building the work around fathers and poverty, but with a focus on young dads. And as a leadership fellowship, it was about delivering on a vision. So I was saying, I think a father-inclusive society is a social justice, feminist-driven agenda that speaks to a whole range of different people nationally and internationally. So not only would we advance academic debate and discussion, but that's a language that professionals use. It's something dads again tell us they want, and we know that from previous research. So how do we bring all of these people together to collaborate, to be a collective? Who deliver on that vision and on that manifesto, on that mission. So the fellowship for the first 4 years, it started in January 2020, was about generating more evidence. So we followed some young dads who'd engaged in previous research study with us, and we now have we followed the parenting journeys of 11 young men over a decade. So some of them are now in their 30s. Their children are the same age now as when they became a father for the first time. And we've been able to see just how much they've been committed to their children over time, how much they've been able to sustain the relationship with their children despite all of the challenges they might have had to navigate. We've co-created a brand new social intervention, so something called the Grimsby Dads Collective. And basically that involves training young dads to talk about their experiences of parenting and engaging with support. And they deliver and provide training to multi-agency professionals around how to be father inclusive, that's driven by their lived experience. And then we also did some comparative work. So what I mean by that is we looked at young dads in the UK and Sweden, and we compared the policy family welfare system over in Sweden with the UK. And going back to your question about comparing the UK and the US, Sweden's by no means a panacea. So what I mean by that is no means perfect. But they have systems that support dads young dads through education, through employment. They have effective housing systems. They have effective social security access. So there are things there that we could bring across to the UK and learn how to better support young dads and make the argument that welfare and policy systems are significant and are important. So that's what we've been doing for the last 4 years. And now I've got another 3 years of funding, and I want to transition what's been a very focused research study into a centre. So that's a collective of people, researchers, all the sort of professionals we've been working with in the last 4 years, and dads, and work together to advocate for and promote this ethos in an evidence-driven way. So the centre now comprises a group of academics, most of whom are based at the University of Lincoln. We're building an advisory panel of professionals from social services, health, social care, and then also we want to bring dads on board to sort of co-produce this centre. And the idea is that if we work together, we have an evidence base, we're much more powerful as a voice and as a movement, if you like, in encouraging policymakers to take this seriously and to see its socioeconomic value as well. One thing I've got planned is a father inclusion hub, so an online repository that's linked to our project website that hosts resources that are accessible to practitioners, academics, whoever's interested really, and so that we have some legacy for all this amazing work that does go on, but often kind of gets lost because of funding issues, or because the political will just isn't there. So it's all very exciting. It
is exciting. I think I want to move. If I didn't have so much work, I love that idea. I love everything about what you just said. And any way I can help, please, call on me, because that's what we do. That clearinghouse, if you get a chance to look at fatherhood.gov, that's what we do. It's an online, it's a bunch of other stuff that surrounds it as well that the government has invested in doing, along with the grantees. And then the other thing, and is some of the other departments like Early Head Start and Healthy Start and housing and others are now putting in their RFPs that a grantee who's applying for these federal funds have to place an emphasis on working with fathers. And so it is spreading, a little bit. And then under my Fathers Incorporated hat, we're launching in June a virtual online resource specifically for dads, just for dads, because whenever you try to incorporate that with governmental work and you're trying to speak to researchers and practitioners and other folks that are in the space and dads, that doesn't typically work. Dads are not trying to come to a website that is run by the government. And so we have decided to do that on our own. And so I am so excited about that thing. I can't sleep at night. I'm so excited. I'm loading it up and loading it up and loading it up and loading it up with stuff.
I do a quick look. So one of the other kind of co-produced or co-created activities we've done through the research is with a specialist authority for young dads in the UK called North East Young Dads and Lads. And with them, we've co-created a online e-learning platform called DigiDad. And DigiDad basically is written by and for young dads. We support around helping to build in research evidence. And we also, again, work with an advisory group of experts. And the dads have basically created these very short videos, podcasts, films that talk about key issues relating to parenthood from the perspective of young dads. So we've got stuff on 0 to 6 parenting, not 6 months for babies. We've got a series on mental health. We've got series on all sorts of different topics that we think young dads might have questions about. And it's so powerful because it's the dads. It's the dads who you see, it's the dads who talk, it's humorous, still speaks to some of the sort of difficult issues that young men face. So it's available worldwide. So yeah, DigiDad, I recommend having a look at that as well.
You have to. Yeah, I'm gonna email you so you can email me
I'll
that,
send you a
because so I can put your links on our resource and we can do it vice versa, so we can even expand even deeper in terms of that.
Yeah.
I'm also curious, right? Because as we are working with these young dads, I joke about this. Got these old dads too, right? And so I keep telling people that these blue pills are doing amazing things, and so more things that we ain't anticipate, because we got dads who are walking into our spaces who are 50 plus. And they're brand new dads, right? And a lot of them, in a very weird way, are single dads, because whatever their relationship was, they're 50 years old now and they got this newborn.
Yeah.
And these newborn, these alpha gen kids aren't the same, as other children. And so as you are working with young fathers, I'm sure that there's still an influx of, more seasoned fathers. That's what I've been calling them lately, more seasoned fathers. Still out there in the space. What are some of the differences that you're seeing with respect to those two cohorts of fathers, those young fathers and those more seasoned fathers?
Yeah, I mean, I think if we look at the research and just based on my engagement with young dads in particular, I think they are more susceptible to some of the kind of socioeconomic challenges. So again, they're establishing parenthood while also establishing themselves as adults, as in terms of thinking about their male identity, who they want to be. They may have come from challenging backgrounds, and that's still very fresh. So all of the kind of trauma that might be associated with that, or some of the ways in which that's impacting on their lack of confidence, or how they feel about themselves. That's all very intense, and that can then impact on how they think about themselves as a dad. It means they might be more likely need support that's holistic, I would argue. So they need that broader sort of involvement around securing housing, securing employment, getting CVs in order, all those kinds of things. I think with older dads, there's going to be things around identity, so you perhaps already know who you are as a man, or you thought you did, and then having a child completely against that, and you have to re-find yourself again. There is entering spaces the first time that are about relationships with children. If those spaces are there, again, we sort of have an issue, certainly in the UK, around a lack of dads groups and a lack of spaces for dads. But when they're there, men highly value them. I'm just thinking about my research with granddads, which I conducted over 10 years ago now. But a lot of them talked about, you want to be physical with the kids, you want to rough and tumble with the kids, and my body's letting me down and I can't do that kind of thing. So again, that makes me think a certain way. But as much as my research is about young dads, really it's about father inclusion, and it's about what people have in common, and being a dad is what people have in common. And these men want to be there for their kids. They want to be supported to be there for their kids. And again, we need to find the language and the activities, the mechanisms that allow that to happen. So, it's a bit of an academic answer to that.
Yeah.
And there's more in common than I think then.
You're researchers, so I know that you all are always concerned about outcomes. And so as you are really moving this research out there, what are you thinking about? What outcomes will occur that say to you that what we have uncovered and what we're putting out there is actually making an impact?
That's a lovely question. And again, it's an innovation research study. So we've tried to not only research what people think and what's going on, but also affect change and try and change things through the research. I'd like to see change at different levels of the system. I think if we listen to dads, we try to support them with what they want and what they need, then we have healthier children, healthier mums, co-parents, healthier men, and men whose well-being is more supported, and then ultimately healthier societies. So, that's a big thing. But actually, if we start at the grassroots and we think at that level, that in and of itself is an impact, and that's a change. I'd like to see father inclusion taught as part of professional training to all professionals, so that it becomes part of their remit, and they have a confidence and an underpinning set of evidence around why it works. So if they are able to engage fathers more effectively, then fathers are hopefully then more equipped to feel more confident to support their children. And then ultimately, I think we need change at the top as well. We need policy. So we need a father inclusive policy. We need investment in the early years that reflects that dads are a resource to their children. And of course, services that feel equipped to support dads when they maybe are engaging in more risky behaviours. I think we shouldn't be shying away from that. I'm very optimistic about father inclusion, but that still sits on top of a whole range of different inequalities and challenges that people are navigating every day. So if we do father inclusion, my hope is that we have societies that are more equipped to flourish. I think families are really foundational to societal well-being, and at the minute we have policies that impact on families, but I don't think we think enough about how families are a useful tool for thinking about more effective policy. So it's trying to shift the conversations and the dialogues towards thinking about how we support longer term well-being of everyone in families and society, really. So it's a big goal.
Wow, yeah, it is. That is. But it's an obtainable goal. It's an obtainable goal.
I like to think so, yeah.
Yeah. Anna, thank you so much. I'm so glad to meet you. I can see why both your dad and your mom are proud of you. I'm proud of you. And I'm just met you, and I'm like, go, girl, let's do this work. Let's change these families. And so I appreciate so much, being in this space. It always warms my heart when I'm working next to women who get it, right? Who understand that this is not just about, trying to overtake, the movements and things that are trying to bring, equity to the space of women, but this is about children. And if we're going to do this thing right, they have to have two strong parents and a strong support system in their lives if they're going to make it in this world. And so I'm appreciative of you doing that wherever you are in the world, right? And so I am in support of you, and I don't know what I could do for you from here, but anything I can do, I'm only a phone call, email, or text away. And so, ladies and gentlemen, this is Anna Tarrant. She is a professor of sociology, and she is the director of the Following Young Fathers Further Study and the head of the new Center for Innovation in Fatherhood and Family Research at the University of Lincoln in UK. Thank you so much again. And to all my I Am Dad podcast listeners, you know how I like to leave you. Always be kind to others as you're kind to yourself, or you might find yourself by yourself. Always shoot high for your goals, because even if you miss, you'll be amongst the stars. And as my good friend and mentor, Art Mitchell, always said to me, it's nice to be important, but you know what? It's much more important to be nice. Till next Sunday, God bless.
Thank you so much for taking the time to spend with us. You've been listening to I Am Dad podcast. We hope that you have been informed, encouraged you to think, or even inspired your heart for the love of dads. The conversation does not end here. Come back and join us next week. Same time, same place. Or you can continue the dialogue on our I Am Dad Facebook page. We also invite you to listen to past episodes, learn more about us, and keep up with special activities by visiting IamDadPodcast.com. That's IamDadPodcast.com. Until next time, I leave you with this reminder of manhood from 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 11. When I was a child, I spoke as a child. I understood as a child. I thought as a child. But when I became a man, I put away childish things. Because of this reminder, I will always understand that I am dad, period.